the soul is incarnating, if you like, or being born into this life. This is the threshold the soul is crossing as the soul is entering into human experience. It's a cliche to say we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but I buy that 100%. It is the threshold of the soul to enter fully into this human experience and embrace it with all of its detail.
Welcome to episode 47 of the Mind That Ego podcast. I'm Ricky Deriz. Today I'm joined by Nick Kettles, who returns to the show having previously discussed the stages of the spiritual journey. Nick is also my co-creator for the YouTube series Archetypes of Awakening. He is a master certified coach and healer with 25 years experience in the human potential movement. He's pursued a meditation practice in the Advaita Vedanta tradition for over 20 years and has worked as a meditation teacher for the last 10 years. I've known Nick for some time and I've been fortunate to witness his natural gift as a guide. This conversation explores Nick's coaching model, Thresholds of the Soul, which draws from Nick's wealth of wisdom, including coaching, depth psychology, and spirituality. What are thresholds? How do we embrace our core wounds? What role do rituals and rites of passage play in our becoming? How does the Labyrinth symbolize the true self and the chakra system? We cover the full spectrum of personal development, from the mythological to the cognitive, from immersion in introspection to the power of meaningful action, from the root to the crown, and everything between. Just a reminder before we jump into the conversation to please like, rate, subscribe, and share to help more people access the podcast. Enjoy. Nick, a warm welcome back to the Mind That Ego podcast. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me back. It's a real pleasure.
So we're going to look at Thresholds of the Soul as a model, as a map for inner work. And I wonder, to begin, if you could give a little background on your journey to arriving at that as a model and as a process, and how you kind of got to that point.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that the journey to arriving at the model also explains the model as well. So it's both and I'd say that the journey begins in my early 20s when I had what a therapist told me at the time was a constructive breakdown, where the net result of many, many adverse childhood experiences and had accumulated so fast that it's like the operating system of me crashed when I was about 23, when I just came out of university. And it became very apparent to me, of course, that I needed some help. So, I was working with a therapist. I was exploring 12-step groups. I was engaging with a wide range of healing practices, such as Reiki. Rebirthing was a very powerful tool for me. And I was aware that that there was something in me that was broken, or that I perceived to be broken. I mean, I really understood that I felt wounded. I felt hurt. I'd say I felt the sting of separation inside. I felt separate from the world. I felt separate from others. I felt separate from myself. And I was doing my best to figure out, well, how do I heal myself? I mean, I that's if you like, in the hero's journey, for me, that was the call, if you like. The call of a breakdown was the call to heal oneself, and there was a huge imperative to do so. I'm 23. I've got a university degree, but my self-esteem is so low, I can't put myself out there for any kind of significant work that pays anything decent. I'm doing menial jobs for below minimum wage, and hustling to basically, pay the rent, subletting off of friends, sleeping on couches. And so there's a job to do. I mean, the imperative at the time was, I got to heal enough just to be functional. I got to level up to function enough to just live a normal life, which is where many people begin their healing journey. And I think in my naivety, and I look back at that younger self and have a lot of love for him, I made a checklist. It's like, right, okay, let's figure out what needs healing. So we got, bad relationship with relative number one, bad relationship with relative number 2, 3. Oh yeah, the guy who assaulted me when I'm 15, and so on. And I think I must have come up with a mental checklist of about 20 different items. And I really thought that's how you did it. I really did. I thought that's how you
Mm.
did it. I mean, I was aware that each of these events had had their own unique impact, had left their own imprint upon my body. We were working at the time, although we didn't call it somatics, we were working with trauma release work. That's what
Mm.
rebirthing and a lot of body work that I was working with at the time was focused on. But I'd had this idea that, they were all different imprints, and I just need to work on each of them and then reprogram it all, and then it will be fine. And what I started to notice is that each time I went into each of the different stories, the different events, I'd start to circle around and come to the kind of similar awareness of how that had impacted me. So at some point I started to see, perhaps there's a place where actually there's just one wound and lots of different ways that that has been created and compounded. And I started to realize that perhaps it was about better understanding the narrative of how I was wounded, the unique pattern in which I had wounded, and how did I therefore adapt after it. So put less attention on trying to take this checklist approach and more on how do I better understand the story which defined how I was wounded, and how did that represent a unique part of my life narrative. So that's a big shift that happened when I came into the coaching world around 36. So I'd been at this for about 12 years by then.
Mm-hmm.
I had a lot of success. I'd released a lot of pressure from my body. I developed a level of agency to kind of get to that functional level, but still not quite feeling as abundant and as empowered as I would wish. And so coaching offers this framework that lets me see perhaps that this wounding experience is part of who I am as a whole person. And then I start to look at my life as a whole, and ask this question: what is the unique narrative of this life? And that was really powerful, because previously I think I've been thinking I got to heal myself and then I can get on with my purpose. I can get on with being of service to the world, and then maybe if I heal myself, then I'll find God as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I got it. I was ignoring the learning or the messages of those life experiences, which a lot of people today call a lived experience. I was just thinking, well, those are just bad things that happened to me, and I just got to erase the imprint of them, and then I'm free, instead of actually starting to see how did they actually define me as part of who I am as a whole person. So that's the shift, and that's really what's at the heart of Thresholds of the Soul, is for us to really consider one's entire life from a very broad perspective and say, what is the unique narrative of you that includes your wounding experience, includes the unique circumstances of your birth and background, and includes the different ways you adapted or to the setbacks, and the different strategies you developed. And then from that broader perspective, get a real sense of what is the essence of this life story. And that's the purpose of Thresholds of the Soul. And so why is it called Thresholds of the Soul? It's called Thresholds of the Soul because I think that is the threshold of the soul, is that the soul is incarnating, if you like, or being born into this life. This is the threshold the soul is crossing as the soul is entering into human experience. It's a cliche to say we're spiritual beings having a human experience, but I buy that 100%. It is the threshold of the soul to enter fully into this human experience and embrace it with all of its detail. And that's a complete, I think, about face, or they say it's a complete reversal of some approaches to spirituality, which is I've got to leave this world, this life behind, a bit like I was trying to do. I've got to find spirit out there. I've got to prepare myself for being good enough for spirit to be in contact with spirit. I've got to purify this vehicle, as opposed to seeing that all of it is spirit. So I don't know. There's the initial response to the question, how did I arrive at it? I'm sure there's other ways of saying it.
No, it's a beautiful overview. Thank you very much. And
Yeah.
from what you say, it sounds like there is that process of, awakening or healing or growth through the wound.
Yeah.
rather than just completely this idea of spiritual bypassing,
Hmm.
trying to completely negate it. One thing that stands out, I know that there's also debate around story, revisiting story,
Yeah.
the narrative of one's life. And there are
Yeah.
different approaches, say in talking therapy,
Sure.
that can maybe overindulge in story versus what you're talking to. How does that process for you
Yeah.
become one that is empowering and actually allows you to move forward compared to just revisiting the past?
Well, I do, as you mentioned, I think it is a form of bypassing to dismiss one's story.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I feel that we have to include to get to the essence of what's a unique narrative for me. I've got to include the story, including how I tell it right now. I can't move on until I do. So we take a very simple approach, which is to say, let's look at the wounding narrative of your life and tell that story in all its raw detail, even if it's told from a victim perspective. That's
Mm,
absolutely fine. And it might be necessary for you to tell it from a victim perspective for a period of time because you were victimized. It's not that you are a victim, you were victimized. And so
mm,
to deny that would be a bypass. And that is a really important step, because our first step, we say, is to bring comfort to the wounded self. The wounded self has often been hidden, marginalized, kind of wrapped up or in different frameworks, analyzed. There's a level of exhaustion around the wounded self, either from hiding it or trying to fix it. So bringing comfort to that, letting it have its space, is a necessary first step. And only then can you start to see, well, how did that inform me? So
mm,
it's a yes, and
mm,
we include it. And it's the same with the adaptation self, or the adaptive self, the one that realizes that this wound is just too much for me to handle. So I got to find a way to mask it and build a bridge with the world in order to maintain my core needs.
mm,
And we'd say with the adaptive self, it's the same. We've got to have compassion for the younger self in me that devised those strategies. We got to say, wow, you did the best you could, given the circumstances. And look, not just did you do the best you did, these adaptive strategies helped you to survive. And some of them, in fact, might have been useful. I mean, there's adaptive and then there's maladaptive and then
mm,
adaptive. There might be some that actually helps you to thrive. So how can we just, one, celebrate the author, no matter whether it was maladaptive or adaptive? It was better than just dissolving into the wound, right? And then we
mm,
bring compassion to that younger self, and only then can we start to discern, is there a gift in the adaptive, and where might you need to let go of some of the story of the adaptive. So there's a process of including and then letting go.
yeah,
That's the approach.
yeah. Almost like the narrative is going to be there regardless. So take ownership of it,
Mm.
own it, process it, and maybe, yeah, find the gift contained within. I really like that framing. It's obviously the name is Thresholds,
Plural, yeah.
plural. So within that, you have various different thresholds. Could you maybe talk through that, how they relate to wounds and adaptive strategies as
Sure.
well?
Um, it works on many levels, and that's why there's a plural. I mean, I mentioned the first one is that a threshold is the soul coming into this life. It's the
Mm-hmm.
soul itself is crossing a threshold, coming into this lived experience, this lived life, this dimension, if you like. That's a threshold in itself. But the thresholds that we're probably more interested in within the work that we're doing are twofold. One is internal, and one appears to be external. And internal is that the wounded and adaptive selves tend to be, although they're actually, have a relationship, one is born from the other, they tend to be in opposition to each other,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we might say a threshold exists between them, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we explore the meeting point of those two things? So sometimes threshold is considered as something I cross, but sometimes it's actually a line or a space, if you like, between two things,
Mm-hmm.
then that becomes something that we're very interested in. And then we can look at that through the lens of ancestral work as well to see where, some of the wounded or adaptive stories in me reflect ancestral patterns as well. So we'd look at the thresholds within a family system as well. But then, of course, there's the thresholds outside of me as well, what appear to be outside of me, which are about my life's journey. We are going through different cycles of development, which are natural. And I think they're encoded into us at a soul level and a biological level. And they get interrupted, of course, by difficult experiences. So in some ways, there's thresholds for us to cross, which one typically might call a rite of passage. We allow a younger self to complete its chapter, to complete its cycle of development successfully enough, so then I can then move on and become more of an integrated adult.
Mm-hmm.
There's not a chapter from my past that's still open, so that becomes a threshold as well. And I think that's an important part of the body of work that we're presenting, is that, especially in the West, we live in a world without any language about rite of passage, or how ritual, or what I sometimes call a meaningful act, because I'm triggered by the word ritual, but it's the same thing. How those meaningful acts, those rites of passages, can actually be ways in which we energize the change that we wish to take place, and usually they're best designed around an idea of a transition from one state to another, which again is a threshold. So
Many directions to go in.
yeah, and many thresholds. That's why
And
it's
many
plural.
thresholds.
If it was just one threshold, then I don't think I'd have enough confidence to create a program called Threshold of the Soul, because it's like a one bet
Hedge your
project.
bets.
It's like and I think the idea of thresholds plural gives the individual permission to identify which is the threshold that I need to look at now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no sense of overwhelm then. It's just like, I'm the author of it. I mean, maybe we'll talk about this later, but my hope is to create a framework that gives individuals an opportunity to be the author of their own development in a more empowered way. So the individual decides what the threshold is. And there may be many, as we progress through life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there can also be a tendency to make them like significant milestones, the idea of crossing a threshold, whereas it seems like they're almost fractal in nature.
Yeah.
They like play out into different degrees.
And there may be big thresholds, of course, that are to transition from one stage of life. I mean, I've not experienced it, but my partner, of course, had told me in intimate detail what it was like to become a mother. That's a massive threshold for her. That would, that's a big one. But then, as you say, they're fractal in nature, and some of these smaller developmental thresholds that we need to cross, to recognize, acknowledge, and then cross, may actually be a microcosm of something far bigger.
Yeah, which makes sense with the model that you have of the wound being like the source. It may be manifest in many different ways, many different stories, outer inner experiences, but it can gravitate around that nucleus of the wound.
Exactly, and that was the point about the checklist. The checklist is like, saw it as death by 1,000 cuts. It's like they're all different wounds. Got a wound on my knee, a wound on my elbow, a wound in my broken nose. It's like considering it like different wounds in the body, as separate from one another. But if you think about it, a wound on one part of the body can, of course, systemically affect other parts of the body. So that's the realization. Individual life experiences may be completely different. There's something wildly different for me in the circumstances of being assaulted physically as a teenager and my parents' divorce. They don't seem to be related one bit at all. And yet there's something about the impact both those events had on me that you could define in a more generic way. They both contributed to the formulation of a wounded narrative.
It's making me think as well of I know you deal with archetypes a lot in this model as well, and mythology, and the underlying patterns that play out from potentially from those wounds, if they're not under, if they're unseen, they're not dealt with,
Mm,
it can initially be difficult to see that. And that example that you give, on the
mm,
surface they look different, but they have some
mm.
similar pattern below them.
Exactly.
The role as well of psychological projection. I wonder if you could talk to that in terms of the difference between claiming where that wound is and starting to do the work versus not bringing awareness to it or being stuck in a adaptive strategy.
Mhm. Well, I think at the most basic level, psychological projection is a good thing because it's a way in which I think we regulate and manage our, avoid becoming overwhelmed with unconscious material. Like
Mm-hmm.
I often say sometimes, that unconscious material or that, and that could be, the damage or what appears to be damage or even my own potential is just too intense, too vital, too strong for me to handle in at different times of my life. So I project it onto other places in order for safekeeping, if you like.
Yeah.
uh, so in some respects, I think having a not beating yourself up about that process is important because it might just be a way in which we're managing unconscious the risk of becoming overwhelmed by unconscious material. But once one recognizes the process of psychological projection, both my capacity to project shadow behavior onto others, as well as to project my gold onto others as well.
Mm-hmm.
My
Mm-hmm.
gold meaning my inner potential. Um, then there's a great sense of liberty, and in the work that I do in Thresholds of the Soul, working within a group is particularly favorable for that because suddenly, I realize that my own story is being constellated, meaning represented, or different facets of it are being represented by the other people in the group in a way that can be particularly revealing. And it's
Yeah.
like suddenly I'm being really moved by someone's wounded story, and I was like, oh well, they're telling part of my story. So it becomes a gift in that respect. It's almost like allowing you, once you recognize it for what it is, you can be a good detective.
Yeah.
Um, and there's many different approaches to that. So one that is anyone can do is to consider, well, who's a hero that you had and or a heroine, and that could be from literature, it could be from film, and then you just sit down and think about, well, what is it that they represent? What is it that I admire? What is it I appreciate? Or what am I grateful to in that image? And then you would need to consider, where does that live within me already that I just don't acknowledge? Or where is it just completely nascent, completely undeveloped? And consider,
Mm.
well, actually, what would it be for me to nurture that? So I don't no longer need someone else to represent it for me. I can just say, okay, it's my job to find it within myself. It can be extraordinarily empowering, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that reflection around projection as well, because I feel in pop self-development world, there can almost be like a sense of militance around having to claim projections at once and really doing the work in a way as if it's a fade-in almost. So I think it's good to have that compassion towards the skillful. It's like the transcendent nature of the psyche, right? And how that plays out. And I like you use that term like detective. It gives you that opportunity um, for
Well,
healing, for integration.
if I can jump in there, I mean, I think one of the gifts of starting my own healing journey so young, well, although if I could do it again, I wouldn't want to start so young. I'd like to have enjoyed more of my adult. I know you and I have talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it's given me enough chance to work with trial and error, and to see that this is a journey. There is no end destination, so I can just relax a little bit
Yeah.
and learn to go a little bit slower. There's a stride. You can be very strident in your healing path. I was when I was younger. Checklist. Okay. I didn't have a social life. I was just like, I got to move on to the next thing. So it can becomes an obsession. And, what is it to move slower, and to to embrace each phase of development as it presents itself. And I think that's a huge thing, is to start to have compassion for one, the part of you that was hurt, one that, tried to mask it, and then also to have compassion for the part of you that wants to heal as
Mm.
well. There can be a sense of urgency around that actually is, can get in the way.
Yeah.
That can lead to you being strident and reclaiming all your projections by tomorrow.
Yeah. I think also, like, for me personally, the frustration, because it is such a long journey, and
Mm.
like when I find myself in difficult moments, there can be a sense of like, by natural, I shouldn't be here by now, which is just a self-denial, right? It's just a way to
Fine now.
by now I should be completely healed, should be
Exactly.
there. But yeah.
I take solace from Carl Jung. He says, I think, I can't quote where he said it, but he said something, I don't know if I'm fully individuated yet. And I think he said that when he was about 80.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like, that's very healthy. He said,
Yeah.
I don't even know. I mean, there's the level of humility. If you think, he would have had to be able to say, I know what individuation, which is the Jungian term for kind of completeness. I'd have to confidently say, I know what that looks like.
Hmm.
There's a huge risk in doing that,
Yeah.
as opposed to saying, I am on this journey and all I know is that I am becoming.
Yeah.
I'm in this process of becoming more of myself. I'm in this process of revealing more of my wholeness, of integrating more of my wholeness, and it's ongoing. And can I be content with that as opposed to anxious about that?
Yeah.
I think that's the edge, and that's hopefully what I would wish people doing my work called Thresholds of the Soul to experience.
Hmm.
I can
Yeah.
just slow down, chill out a little bit,
Yeah.
the hurry to get it all done, and just learn to be more content with where I am.
Hmm. Yeah. That idea of like, not even necessarily radical acceptance, just
Yeah,
acceptance in general is huge, right? And I know, having done the course as well, I would say that fundamentally acceptance was one of the biggest takeaways for me, especially being in a group setting.
yeah,
I wouldn't go as far to say catharsis, because I know that has certain connotations, but just the healing of the space.
yeah.
You mentioned as well how other people's wounds can reflect your own, how you can share, and I feel so isolated. I know I did many times. I'm like, I'm alone in this, what I feel, and then see other people resonate. And I think
Mm.
that community of healing is really powerful, and it's not something I naturally gravitate toward. Like I can want to isolate to heal. So yeah, it was really, really powerful for me personally. And I'm not
Thank
just
you.
saying that because you're on the podcast. I mean,
Thank you.
I mean that. I wonder. So we've touched upon, and we're talking around like integration,
Yeah,
the idea of these wounds, often these thresholds between like the maybe extremes. I know a big one for me was too much, not enough. That
yeah,
dynamic
yeah.
as one of them, and integrating that in its wholeness, so there's not such a, I guess, an oscillation. At least in my experience, it can feel a bit binary at times. So we've touched upon that, and also the archetypal mythological. I wonder if you could explain how those mythological structures can support integration
Yeah,
in this format.
absolutely. I think it's in there's probably more to say about it, but for the sake of simplicity, um, if you think about the psychological metaphorically is a bit like the river on the surface, right? It has currents, it has depth, it can have depth. It could be a river, it could be a lake, you know.
Hmm.
But the mythological is like the water table that's much, much further below the surface that feeds that lake or those rivers. And I think there's opinions about, well, what is valid and what is not. Where do you need to go? And you have schools of thought that say, well, you need to, go into the mythological. That's where your healing is. And then there's the psychological, psychotherapeutic schools that ignore the mythological.
Mm.
Don't have a lot of time for that. And I think it's both. You need to oscillate between the two. So, for example, in looking at some of the developmental experiences that happened to me that left me dysregulated, you know, it's really been helpful for me to understand that from a psychological point of view. What was the impact that had on my psyche? How I developed my ego as an executive function, and therefore ability to say yes and no to certain life experiences, set boundaries. How did that formulate the story of me, the persona that I wish to present to the world? And indeed, what damage did that do to my nervous system? Where did it leave me dysregulated in that respect? You know, and what was my favorite trauma response? Was it fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Understanding those events from a psychological point of view is really, really helpful, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, necessary. It was, it's liberating, you know, especially looking at it through the body to recognize, my body, my nervous system, but and I speak personally here, my nervous system was more hypo aroused. You know, I developed a freeze fawn response to life. So a development of passivity, you know, as a way of retaining my relationship with the world, right? And getting my needs met. Been phenomenal way of understanding what happened. And that's helped me heal as well from a somatic point of view. You know, I can, you know, enter into the right kind of transformative work, meditation, Tai Chi, yoga, really powerful somatic trauma release work in the body, other body works that really help me find a new set point in my nervous system. All good. But that might not be enough for me to really fully grasp the fuller message of that life experience. And that's where the mythological really helps, because the mythological structures go beyond the kind of, you know, the linear deductive mind, and they present themselves in images and archetypal narratives. So one story, for example, mythological story that really resonates with me is the underdog. It's in the fairy tale, it's the third son, you know, the one that is ignored, you know, is the you know, this, you know, sometimes perceived as an idiot, you know, or they're very poor, you know. It's like Dick Whittington is an example of that. You know, he goes to London, you know, to seek his fame and fortune. He's the underdog, you know, everything is against him. And there's something in those stories, those archetypal structures, that speaks to something way beyond the conscious mind. It's almost like it's like fertilizer for the unconscious. I don't know how to describe it, but it's vitalizing. Suddenly I find I know where I stand. I know where I can orientate myself in the narrative of my life. If I'm just looking at that event, those series of events that left me dysregulated and learned that passive hypo aroused response, I'm just looking at it in isolation. I'm not able to see how it influenced the narrative of me in such an empowered way as looking at through a mythological lens. And I think that you need to do both. And one of my teachers said, you know, sometimes you got to dive deep into the mythological and really get lost there. And then you got to come up for air and find a psychological framework that lets your mind make sense of it and then go on again. And so it's that oscillation. And I think that's a term that we don't see used a lot in psychological or developmental literature that would be really useful for us to use. It's not this or that. It's like I allow myself to oscillate between those poles in a way that serves my growth. And if you become sensitive to your own cycles of growth, you'll know there's a point where you dive so deep into the psychological and then you feel like, oh my God, none of this makes sense. I just got a load of head food. It's at that moment you got to go into the mythological. And there's a point when you're in the mythological where you're just like, oh my God, I'm just lost in images and archetypes and none of it makes any sense. That's where you got to come out and find a psychological framework. And that process of oscillation is at the heart of what I'm trying to offer as well. I think it's essential for us to reach that deeper level of integration in our healing journey. At least it has been for me. It's been phenomenal.
Does
that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I really like that description as well. Like it you know, it speaks to me as someone that, and I was going to actually mention earlier or ask you about like the locus of control and this idea of the inner the outer, taking action
Yeah.
versus like inner work. And I know that at least in the last few years, my strong tendency has been introspection, immerse. I've had the fortune or lack of fortune to be inundated by like unconscious material through psychosis experiences like that, and
Right.
not always having a choice, but
Yeah.
experiencing the potency of that dimension,
Mm. Mm.
and also what can be confusing if there's not, it's not so easy to discern ways to bring those symbols into something coherent, that it can be
Yeah.
very raw and primordial. And I think there's that, I found the same, like there can be relief in something like cognitive behavioral therapy. It
Right.
can be relieving just to be like, reframe your thoughts, see
Yeah.
what you're thinking, see how it affects your emotions, reframe it. And that is, I've had conversation, I was speaking to a guest before, Prakash Khalsa, who's big into meditation, and he was talking about different scales
Mm.
and how different tools work on those different levels, which sounds very similar to this. It's like,
Mm.
to interpret, you're not going to use cognitive behavioral therapy to interpret a dream.
No.
But there is that interplay, right, between the real depthful
So
and
powerful to be
yeah.
able to say, I see that there is a part of my mind that is telling me this.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a radical step
Yeah.
for any one of us. I'm still prone to self-identify with thoughts as opposed to knowing I have thoughts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's huge,
Yeah.
you know. And I think if you take it further, you're talking, I think, also about inner work. I think there's an in-breath, out-breath in the cycle of development. And that's also, you might say, a threshold that we work with. And you're talking about it in terms of locus of control too, as well. I think that plays out the in-breath and out-breath. We need to go inward to find the locus of control. We might want to call it the psychological center of gravity on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's often where people find themselves in when they realize, oh my God, I don't like my life. I realize I've been hurt. Something needs to be changed. Is there's a realization that the center of gravity or the locus of control, the center of control is on the outside.
Yeah.
Life is doing me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Life is happening to me. I am defined by circumstances as opposed to being able to influence circumstances. Of course, there's some circumstances in our world systemically that are subject to glacial change. So we're not talking about you find your locus of control and then suddenly you become superhuman and you solve all the world's problems.
Mm.
It's about, do you have the capacity to choose how you're seeing the external circumstances and therefore choose to influence them
Mm-hmm.
in a way that is the nature of inner power, inner empowerment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the cycle of growth, I think, needs to recognize that there's a flow of awareness inwards to find that locus of control. But there's a point also where I won't know if I found it unless I start to act on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually a framework that coaching has that I think is essential to thresholds of the soul. So where it sounds like it borrows itself from spiritual development work and psychotherapy, which it does a lot. Actually, one of the frames is coaching. And what makes coaching different is that it says action through conscious choice is important. And
Yeah.
I take action to integrate awareness. And without that, I just have awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a big hole or a big trap a lot of people fall into is I just collecting awareness
Yeah.
and nothing's changing. And
Mm-hmm.
so I've got to be willing to cross those thresholds on the outside and take a risk to act differently, whether it's a small action or a big action. I won't know the value of that awareness. I won't integrate that new awareness about who I am until I do. So,
Mm. Wow. Yeah. It also, that talks to the symbiotic nature of inner and outer.
yeah,
And I think there can be almost like a superficial divide. Like if you're doing inner work, like you create this, I'm doing inner work, and then I've got the world out there, which it can
yeah,
maybe be an imbalance for a lot of people that are overly focused on the world and then go within. And I know, yeah, at the moment, at the time I'm at in life, there's an imbalance towards the interior world, and
absolutely.
I resonate a lot with that. And also how the mythological, the symbolic, is not, this idea of it's also intrinsic to what we see as the outside world. So dreams and their manifestation and what they point to actually also point to action, right? But it can be
Yeah.
like I like to think of it at times like well, I guess that you can use the phrase like collective unconscious, but there is a inner psychological / emotional spiritual dimension to the world just as much, and that action is just bridging the two almost through
I,
movement.
I agree. And that I think that's part of life's mystery is that, if you look out to the world as viewed by our consensus reality, it could look a bit dull. I mean, I'm not talking about massive geopolitical events that are happening in the world. Clearly there's a lot of drama happening in the world, but the basic existence of each person is, quite ordinary, and yet the more we recognize the richness of our inner world, the more we see it on the outside too. And we see our life is wow. We can become in awe of life's rich tapestry. I know it sounds like a cliche, but we see so much is interwoven,
Yeah.
and that there's days when, you could almost interpret the events of your day in the same way you'd interpret a dream at night. And that's where the
Yes.
boundaries of, inner and outer start to dissolve, to your point. But I don't
Yeah.
think it will dissolve, to your point, unless you're willing to take action. There's something about our world that, we're here to understand what is it to act, um, to develop a relationship with the idea of having a personal will, and how do I act upon that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's scary for a lot of people in spiritual development, because they feel like, oh my God, I don't want to I don't want to be bold in
Mm.
taking actions because I fear then that's coming from my ego, you know.
Yeah.
But then the part of you that's saying that is probably your ego too.
Yes. Yeah. And as an extension of that, I know for me, the space that I'm in, it feels like there's the experience. It's almost like I'm having a midlife crisis at a slightly younger age, because there's this sense of like the unlived life.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you mentioned before the word vitality, and just this. I'm really happy to just be transparent about that. Like, I know that there's an untapped potential in the world in taking action. And I know in Jungian terms, there's a lot around that, bringing that forward in a way where that energy can be channeled. And often the intensity of that energy, if it's not moved and directed in a certain way, can become panic, anxiety, anger, rage, like overwhelming processes. But it's actually also got a direction to it, I find. And I think I'm in that kind of in-between process of where does that energy want to
Well,
operate in the
I
world,
think you illuminate what needs to be clarified, and I'm grateful for that, because um, I'd say before my growth, I was taking loads of action and I was just creating more chaos. And I was taking
Mm-hmm.
action to hide and mask my wound, and taking action to try and, you know, um, further the success of my adaptive strategies. And that's just creating more chaos. And I think what we're talking about here is taking action in alignment with the awareness of who you are.
Yeah.
So maybe initially it's a good thing to take less action while you
Mm.
do that inner reflection work, but there's a point where you will tap out if you don't. There's a
Yeah,
point where
definitely.
more awareness ain't going to make a jot of difference, and actually the edge is for you to act. And in
Yeah.
fact, growth that you will go through will be 10x
Mm-hmm.
what you would go through with just more awareness,
Mm-hmm.
just by that one action to say no to something, to change a relationship, to let a relationship go, to declare a passion. I had a client recently where they were talking about, how important the message of love was to them in
Mm.
their work. I said, well, why don't you just do it? Say it out loud in a public forum. And they were like, all right. And I know that actually that one action that took 30 seconds for them, they've reported back to me subsequently, is, you know, like exhilarating.
Mm-hmm.
They learn more about the message of love and the telling of the message of love than they did. Any further reflection would have made a jot of difference. I don't know what I don't know until I'm acting upon it.
Mm-hmm.
The action just offered so much more. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much more we could explore there, but I'm
Yeah,
gonna
of course, it's a rich
it's
world.
yeah,
There's
it's
so much.
really, really fascinating.
We're in
And like
the mystery of personal development world. I just riffing on that. I was doing some market research recently, and I said one of the questions I came up with is to people who are interested in personal development, self-improvement, whatever you want to call it. I said, why do we do this? I said,
mm,
one, it costs a lot of money, ultimately,
yeah.
costs you your time. And I was just curious, why do we do it? And, the range of responses was really interesting, but the overwhelming response were two key things. One is a sense that this is this is the one life, I have. I want to make sure I use it well and I
Mm,
contribute. And the second one was this desire to have more agency, you know.
yeah.
And I think that's a good measure
Yeah.
for the success of any intervention you choose to work with. Is this helping me have a greater sense of my capacity to leave my mark, to contribute, and plus have agency in my life? Hopefully
Mm,
those two things go together.
yeah. Yeah, I like the idea as well of almost like the cosmic blueprint or the soul's blueprint
Yeah.
that has a yearning to be manifested. And
Yeah.
those wounds are what can kind of keep that at bay often.
Yeah. And am
Um,
I gonna I think it's do you want to have your best shot at that
mm,
and
mhm.
fail,
Yeah,
or just carry on, you know
yeah, yeah. Stuck in those grooves of patternicity and
yeah.
um, on the subject of grooves and patterns, I'd like to
Good segue.
segue. It was good, wasn't it? I'm
Yeah,
proud of
very
myself
good.
for that. Yeah. To segue into the labyrinth,
I know
uh,
what's coming. Yeah.
symbol
Yeah.
for the South. This I know is a big part also of thresholds.
Yeah.
Could you talk to that as that symbol for the South? And
Sure. Are you going to share a picture or something? Or
I will in post production. So magically now,
oh,
as we talk, it
yeah,
will
it's
appear.
here,
It's
right?
here. It's
Okay.
just
Well,
arrived. Yeah.
um, first of all, we'll make a distinction of the labyrinth. There are dozens of images of the labyrinth, and there's um, uh, I think the technical term. I'm not a scholar, so I don't know if it's correct, but there's one that's called multi-cursal, which means it has many pathways. It's a bit like the equivalent of a garden maze, and
Hmm.
that might be like the idea of the maze uh, um, in Crete with the Minotaur in the center. So there's this sense of it being multi-cursal is the word. Lots of different pathways. It is like a maze, the labyrinth. And then there's another kind of labyrinth, which is called unicursal, which just has one pathway that you follow. Now, it's not a straight line. It goes in, backwards and forwards, but it has one starting point and one end point. There's no dead ends. And there's a particular image of the labyrinth, which is unicursal and has one beginning point and one end point, and it has effectively 7 rings that lead you into the center. So seven's a very symbolic number. What makes this particular image of the labyrinth, of which again there are others, you see 12 ring versions, all kinds of different versions of labyrinths. The one in Chartres Cathedral is much more complex than this 7 ring unicursal labyrinth. But what makes this particular one particularly potent is that we can find images of it all over the world from ancient cultures. It's just quite incredible. So it
Hmm.
suggests, if you're looking at it from a Jungian point of view, that it's an image that one belongs to the collective, right? And two, at some point in time, had some meaning and some it represented something, because and maybe you see it on the images you're showing now, is that we see it in Afghanistan, in Sri Lanka, in India, in Andhra Pradesh. Then there's the Celtic versions, which we see in Galicia and Britain and Ireland. And then there's the image on Greek coins. And then there's also this image from the Hopi Indian, which is called the man in the maze. And it's exactly the same. 100% exactly the same. So you have to say, wow, somewhere, and it looks like it's a couple of thousand, maybe more thousand years older than old. This was very meaningful. It represented something. So there's lots of theories of what it represents. And in transparency, the interpretation that I use was given to me by a man called Drumvalo Melchizedek. So some of your listeners might have heard of him. He's the person that's responsible for the manifestation of most literature around the idea of the flower of life, sacred geometry on the planet today. The idea of the Merkaba, which is the human light body, is his work. He kind of synthesized all the information from the different mystery traditions and brought it forward in the early 90s. Now, I was lucky enough to work with him in the mid to late 90s. I became a facilitator of his, and so had time to chat with him. And in fact, he mentions it in one of his books as well. But we had a brief chat about it. And he said, "Oh yeah, the Labyrinth. It's the 7 chakras, and the sequence of pathways guide you through the 7 chakras in a unique way that is not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7." And he said, if you walk through a labyrinth and recognize that when you're walking through the 4th pathway, it's the heart, and the 7th, it's the crown, you might notice a shift in energy. I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. I said, I'll do that next time I go down to Glastonbury, where there is one. It's actually the Tor, which is one of your images there, is the Tor in Glastonbury is a labyrinth itself in 3 dimensions. And he said, oh, you don't need to do that. He said, just draw one on a piece of paper and then run your finger around it. You'll feel the same. And so it's true. So I was looking for a framework for a framework that would allow us to propose the idea of growth as a journey that had different stations along the way, so that we could pace it. So it wasn't just opening a space and seeing what happened, but it would give some structure to it. Because in order to create psychological safety in a group setting, in a class, you need to do that. It's giving a little bit of structure is important. So that's what I did. The labyrinth became the image of the self, broken down into 7 pathways, 1 for each of the chakras. And in the journey of Thresholds of the Soul, we explore the different wounds, archetypal wounds, and therefore the different adaptive strategies that arise from those wounds as they correlate to the different chakras. So a very simple example makes a lot of sense that the root chakra is about home and belonging. It's the wound of belonging. I think a lot of people who listen to this would recognize that, a sense of knowing or feeling that I'm not wanted, I'm an outsider. And what are some of the adaptive strategies I develop in order to overcome that wound? That's what we explore when we're looking at pathway number 1, when we're looking at the root chakra and the wound of belonging, and we do that together in a group. So I just think it's a fascinating model. I don't know if that's exactly how people 2,000 plus years ago used it in their mystery schools. Drumvalo Melchizedek told me that was one way to interpret it. And my experience is that actually there is some kind of energetic attunement. I wouldn't call it a transmission, but I'd call it an attunement that happens when together you walk through the labyrinth, metaphorically, and put your attention on those different energy centers and the different unconscious material that's often located in those energy centers. And now you've taken the class, maybe you'll say whether that was true or not. And it provides us with a framework for, proposing a beginning and an end for the journey that I invite people to go on. Yeah. Does that answer your question? I mean, I did my best to compress both what it is and its use in Thresholds of the Soul.
Yeah, it was a very, very good answer to the question. Thank you. And yeah, I certainly felt that. You know, the potency of that, not only as a symbol, but as a journey, because it's not, these psychological, spiritual, mythological journeys, they're just not linear,
Mhm.
are they? And I feel that capturing that aligned to the chakras is really powerful because it doesn't negate any, series category of development, which I think is super important, but also just the fact that you are following through in a certain way and then looking at the different strategies and the essentially the defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
I know, and I know you kind of reiterate this in the course, but there was some that they just have more life to them, and like you can
Yeah, of
sense,
course.
like it's the
Yeah.
beginning of the session, you're like, oh no, I'm feeling nervous about this one. Like I can sense that
There's
there
something
is
there.
something there. Yeah. Um, and I imagine, I mean, because you've spoken about it being a lifelong process, that it's a continual journey, right? You go through, then back again, and
Yeah.
I'm sure there are times where different parts of that process resonate more or have kind of more untapped
Yeah.
material. But I think actually, I did a reading. I'm happy to kind of share this, but more became evident for me after when I was reflecting on, because I know there was a lot that was surfacing for me around like the poetic and creativity.
That's right. I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, and then since like after that, I was actually reflecting on intensity. That
Mm.
was a big one that came up, and the rejection wound, the self
Yeah.
rejection wound,
Yeah.
and that it. And I say this broadly, not only related to the course, but broadly in terms of like how awareness or insight can land, because it's almost
Mm.
sometimes it can it it can almost lack the emotional impact at the time. You kind of find yourself talking about something and you're, oh yeah, like intensity, but yeah, I'm all about the poetry or, whatever. And then over time, there's a bit of an aha moment of, oh, that was ahead of its time almost. Like it was an insight that started a process.
Mm. Mm.
So I think yeah, the way that it's structured around that really helps as well. Because of that pacing and the kind of gentleness.
Well, we're still only looking at one wound,
Yeah.
and one ultimately is this idea that there's a way in which your wound is you know the unique narrative of your wound, but we're just giving you the opportunity to look at it through seven different optics that we
Hmm.
call seven archetypal wounds, and somewhere from that material you can pretty much identify how you did you know
Yeah.
uh, and that can be really helpful. So it's a useful pathway, and I'm always curious about it, how it serves in that particular order. Like I said, it's not a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 order. And if you look into certain mystery schools, there are, again, proposals that you work through your own healing process through the chakras. There's, I think it's the one, possibly the Gnostic tradition is, start at the crown and work down to the root chakra.
Mm.
It's the opposite of what you would think.
Yeah.
Uh, and there's lots of other traditions that have proposed that you have to grow through the development of different chakras first. I mean, Maslow's hierarchy of needs suggests that if you try to open up the crown and the third eye before you've kind of integrated the solar plexus, the sacral and the root chakra, then you're going to be top heavy, you
Mm.
know.
Mm.
And I remember in my own growth in my 20s, I mean, I think it was pretty random sometimes. I remember my heart opening very powerfully and wanting to be in service, but the solar plexus, sacral, and root chakra was still carrying a lot of damage, a lot of unprocessed, unconscious material. And so it left me very vulnerable.
Hmm.
And yeah, I was experiencing a lot of unconditional love, a lot of sense of longing to serve and heal humanity. And yeah, I was totally out of balance. So, the chakras can be a very useful framework for anyone.
Hmm.
And the labyrinth just proposes looking at them in a particular sequence that is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also, yeah, a great example around, because as you were saying that, it was actually reminding me as well of that insight around how, because I know, like, to kind of name it, like some people are quite um label like the chakras, put them in as like woo woo, and like, oh, there's, the materialistic paradigm, there's no evidence of all that bullshit, but
That's fine.
it's fine. The interior, the subjective experience, especially if you do take time in meditation and inquire into, well, what is it actually, what is the experience of being a conscious being, then I think that's why they are not only evident, in many different traditions, but why people come back to them again and again. Because subjectively, there do seem to be energy centers that operate in that way, linked to certain things. And I really like what you shared, because I've had similar, like my pathway.
Mhm.
I've had a really like significant crown, like third eye crown awakening, without necessarily the root grounding. So the imbalance in that, kind of all these like mystical visions, but then detaching a bit from like the world out there, and then also the opening to unconditional love can and is exhilarating, but like you say, it can actually leave you super vulnerable. And I know that a lot of practices, be it meditation, be it psychedelics, can unlock certain chakras when maybe others are blocked, and create energetically a lot of like confusion and imbalance.
Yeah, and I think that's part of just looking at the broader perspective, and maybe with some compassion that everyone is doing their best to some degree in
Hmm.
this wonderful world of healing and transformation that we swim in. Is that, to heal, one first has to acknowledge perhaps that the internal operating system I've developed, the mask, the adaptive, is no longer fit for purpose. So I've got to be willing to dismantle it.
Hmm.
So I've got to step into this. And this is in the basic Jungian literature about, transformation. I've got to step into a liminal space where basically it's chaotic. I've got to admit that my current level of order is limited, right?
Hmm.
It's no longer serves its purpose. And in order to heal, I've got to step into this liminal, meaning transformative space in which I can allow it to kind of blow up, if you like. And and then see it clearly, see its different parts clearly, one from another, see what is extraneous that I don't need, see what needs to be healed, to be soothed, see what needs to be reframed, see what needs to be brought into dialogue with each other. And that can be particularly chaotic.
Mm.
Um, and, and then at some point, there's enough coalescence between enough of the different parts for you to perhaps exit out and have a new sense of, here's the new working model, the new operating system, and then move on again until it happens again. It's a cycle
Yeah.
of, constructive breakdown, seeing different pieces, bringing them together, and then moving on and doing it, moving on and finding new agency in life. And depending on the nature of your wounding experience, that chaos could be overwhelming. And that's why it's so important to pace yourself
Yeah.
and to really be discerning about, one, who you work with, and two, you know, the ensuring that you feel safe in that process. And I think if we're looking at a trend over time, we're seeing a trend towards creating more safety, and the idea of, you hear like the language of tritation, for
Hmm.
example,
Hmm.
with regard, well, we don't need to just create a massive reliving of the original wound and the catharsis based on that. We can allow the emotion to be traded, the big intense emotion, to be processed in smaller chunks. So there's I think, a growing awareness of how do we not manage, but how do we modulate that chaos in a way that ensures that someone doesn't get overwhelmed. But,
Hmm.
you know, um, there's no guarantees, and at least what I'm offering from the Labyrinth journey is that there's a way in which we pace ourselves. You take what you need. There's no hurry. We
Yeah.
talk about the importance of balancing courageous honesty with supreme gentleness. There's a lot of work at slowing down. There's a deep emphasis on acceptance that is so necessary, really. So yeah, I hear you. You can blow a chakra open and it's amazing and you get all the fruits of it. And then it's kind of like the other ones aren't singing from the same hymn sheet, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
But,
exactly.
but, you know, if there's lots that are blocked, you gotta address them. You know, a healing journey,
Yeah.
unfortunately, can be tough. That's why it's called the road less traveled.
Hmm.
But everyone wants to do that, you know.
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
might just enter into these experiences at a superficial level, and that's enough,
Yeah.
you know, and that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. And there's also sometimes, like you're describing, there's when it is particularly intense, there's still a lot of information there. It might take longer to process and integrate, but or there is still, I think, at times an intelligence to the imbalance when there's a huge influx of a certain energy. Maybe that is a recalibration, or at the time, like you mentioned, chaos. It can feel very, very chaotic, but there is an intelligence to it.
Well, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I would agree in hindsight.
Hmm.
And I also think that it can be about learning to trust your body as well. And the it's a cliche. You're not going to get anything that you're not ready for. It does
Mm-hmm.
just hold up quite well, actually. And I seem to remember in my 20s when I had the breakthrough in my early 20s, I felt like I was constantly in some growth cycle for about 10 years that just never stopped. But actually, there were long pauses between the big, intense moments of transformation. So it never became ultimately overwhelming, but it did
Mm-hmm.
require my commitment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Nick, I'm gonna bring us to a close there because I feel like we've covered so
Covered a
much
lot.
ground, and it's really it's
I'm
been such a
grateful.
pleasure talking with you about this, and
Thank you.
also covering the thresholds of the soul, something that I found personally deeply meaningful. Really, just appreciate the work that you're doing, and also the well-roundedness of what you do. And I know we're friends now, but we also work together, and I
Mm.
really appreciate our relationship and what you bring to the field in terms of
Okay.
looking for wholeness and looking to approach not only the kind of advanced spirituality, but really going into what is difficult in a such a considerate way. And for me personally, it really stands out. So I just want to thank you for that.
Thank you. If it's frustrating sometimes, but I really want to make a big commitment to celebrating the mundane and the ordinary. You know, you and I have chatted. I've said sometimes I think I've had a greater spiritual experience at a football match, than I
Hmm.
have, in a temple. Um, and sometimes I can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
And that's really what I'm a big stand for, is embracing all of life, and there are times when you need to retreat from the world. I get that, in order to heal, to reject the world that hurt you, but there's a point in where reintegrating with that is so important. And notions of you know uh um that spiritual growth has to be created in some kind of like spiritual community that excludes the mundane, that doesn't work for me
Hmm.
at all.
Yeah.
I think that we find a lot of what is spiritual in the mundane and in what is humorous as well, you know
Yeah.
which
That is definitely a big part of it, isn't it? Bringing
maybe that's a
lightness,
conversation,
lightness. Yeah.
sadly, why so much spiritual growth lends itself to satire.
Mhm. Yeah. Increasingly so,
Yeah,
unfortunately. Yeah.
doesn't do itself any favors in that respect. And I'm sure I've been guilty of that myself in the past, of being overly earnest about what it is, and just not accepting accepting the imperfection of this mad world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And finding the beauty in that as well,
yeah,
despite it all.
100%. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Ricky. I really
Thank.
appreciate the opportunity to share more about thresholds of the soul. And if anyone wants to get in touch, you can just pop over to the website or reach
Mhm.
out to me, and I'd be happy to have a chat. We have programs coming up in one starting in October and one in January. So if this calls you and you want to take that deeper dive, it is a deeper dive into your own growth, then have a look at the website and get in touch. Be happy to chat.
Yeah, highly recommended on my behalf
Thank you
as well. Thanks so much, Nick.
Yeah. All right then.
Absolute pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mind That Ego podcast. To stay up to date, you can join the Mind That Ego mailing list if you head to mindthatego.com/MFM. You'll also get a copy of my book, Mindsets for Mindfulness, when you join. You can also follow Mind That Ego on Facebook and YouTube, where the podcasts are also displayed in video format along with other inspired videos that I create. Or if Instagram is more your social media of choice, you can follow me at Ricky_Deriz. That's DERISZ.